Hi everyone, this is Yuda, an immigration lawyer. Today, I'm going to give you a thorough explanation of the requirements for obtaining permanent residency in Japan. I will also cover the review guidelines and explain the conditions in detail. So, if you are really serious about applying for permanent residency, be sure to watch this video until the end. First, let me briefly talk about the current situation regarding permanent residency. Recently, Japan has been preparing a new system to replace the technical intern training program with a framework that focuses on developing foreign workers. At the same time, Japan has been carrying out policies to actively accept more foreign nationals. For example, there was a reform of the Immigration Control Act last year, and there was another reform 2 years ago. Many of you may have seen these reforms in the news. As a result, the number of medium and long-term residents has been increasing by about 300,000 per year, and it is expected to continue to increase in the future. Naturally, if Japan continues to review permanent residency applications under the same standards as before, the number of people who obtain permanent residency will also increase. Now, permanent residency is different from other statuses. Once you obtain permanent residency, there will be no further reviews of your status of residence. In other words, permanent residency represents the final review for foreign nationals who wish to live in Japan permanently. However, because there is no further review after a person obtains permanent residency, there have been some cases in which permanent residents fail to pay taxes or fail to comply with Japanese laws. Although these cases are very few overall, such situations do exist. Because of this, in last year's reform of the Immigration Control Act, Japan added new grounds for revoking permanent residency. In addition, although this has not been officially announced, in practice it is very clear that the review of permanent residency applications has been becoming stricter every year. Therefore, it is no longer the case that one can simply think this condition was accepted in the past, so it will be accepted now. Or, my friend obtained permanent residency under similar circumstances, so I will be fine. That is no longer valid. If you want to continue to live in Japan in a stable and continuous way, it is very important to carefully confirm the requirements for permanent residency. It is also very important to understand what kinds of actions could result in revocation of permanent residency after it has been obtained. So, from this point on, let me give you a detailed explanation of the requirements for permanent residency. What is a permanent resident? A permanent resident is one of the statuses of residents under the Immigration Control Act. For foreign nationals who hold other statuses of residence, there are restrictions on what activities they can engage in, as well as limits on the period of stay. However, permanent residents are not subject to such restrictions. In other words, granting permanent residency represents the final review concerning a foreign national's residency in Japan, and therefore it must be carried out appropriately. It is also important to note that permanent residency is different from naturalization. Naturalization results in the acquisition of Japanese nationality, and therefore there is no system for revoking it, nor any possibility of deportation. However, permanent residency is still a status of residence under the Immigration Control Act, so it can be revoked, and permanent residents may be deported if they fall under the grounds for deportation. The basic concept of permanent residency. According to the review guidelines, the basic concept is that the applicant must have lived in Japan for a considerable period of time without any problems in his or her residency status, and it must be assumed that there will be no problems in continuing to reside in Japan in the future. What is considered to be without problems is defined in detail in the review guidelines. The 3 legal requirements. By law, there are 3 major requirements for permanent residency. 1. The person must be of good conduct. 2. The person must have sufficient assets or skills to maintain an independent livelihood. 3. The person's permanent residency must be considered to be in the interest of Japan. Let us now go through each of these one by one. 1. Good conduct. Good conduct means following the law and living in a way that doesn't cause problems or criticism in society. Specifically, it means you don't fall under the following categories. Someone who has broken Japanese law and has been sentenced to prison or fined. Someone who is currently under protective measures under the Juvenile Act. Someone who repeatedly engages in illegal or socially disruptive behavior in daily life. Now, here's a common question. If you have a criminal record from, say, 10 years ago, does that mean you can never get permanent residency? The answer is no. There are exceptions. In some cases, your past offense may not count against you. For example, if your criminal record has been officially expunged, if you received a suspended sentence and the suspension period ended without being revoked, if your rights have been restored after completing your sentence. So let's break this down. Earlier, I mentioned the concern, if I have a criminal record, does that mean I'll never qualify for permanent residency? The truth is, if your sentence has been expunged, you may no longer be treated as someone with a criminal record. That means after a certain period of time, you could still be eligible. So, what is expungement? It's a legal system that makes your past sentence lose its effect once certain conditions are met. In other words, it's treated as if you were never sentenced in the first place. For reference, this comes from Article 34(2) of the Penal Code. For example, if you were sentenced to imprisonment or more, and after finishing or being exempted from the sentence, you go 10 years without being punished again for an offense punishable by a fine or higher, the sentence loses its effect. If you were sentenced to a fine or less, and after finishing or being exempted from the sentence, you go 5 years without being punished again for an offense punishable by a fine or higher, the sentence loses its effect. If you received a suspended sentence, and 2 years pass without you committing another crime punishable by a fine or higher, then that suspension loses its effect. So if you fall into one of these categories, you're not considered to be disqualified under the good conduct requirement. This means that even with a past criminal record, if enough time has passed and the legal conditions are met, you may still be granted permanent residency. Alright, so there are 2 more cases where a person is not considered to be of good conduct. The first is when someone is still under protective measures under the Juvenile Act. In that situation, they cannot be regarded as meeting the good conduct requirement. The second is when, in daily life, someone repeatedly engages in illegal acts or disruptive behavior that disturbs public order. In other words, people who cause trouble for their community. Now let's look at some typical examples of this second category. One example is traffic violations. If someone repeatedly commits traffic offenses, like not wearing a seatbelt or using their phone while driving, that can fall under this category. In practice, there's a clear guideline. If you have had your driver's license suspended, you generally cannot get permanent residency until at least 5 years have passed since the suspension. This is not actually written in the law, but in reality, if less than 5 years have passed since a license suspension, immigration authorities will usually say you are not of good conduct and the application will be denied. In fact, almost no one gets approved in that situation, so if you've had a license suspension, you should wait at least 5 years before applying for permanent residency. Another example is shoplifting or petty theft. Even if you haven't received a formal criminal conviction, if you have multiple records of such misconduct, you may be considered not of good conduct. And here's one more common example. Working beyond the limit of your visa permission. Let's say a family is applying for permanent residency together. The husband, who is the main applicant, works full-time as a company employee. The wife, who has a dependent status of residence, is also living in Japan. Under the dependent visa, she can work part-time with special permission, but there is a strict limit of 28 hours per week. However, some people go over that limit and work more hours than they are allowed. If that happens, immigration sees it as a violation of the rules. That means the person is not considered to be of good conduct, and permanent residency will not be approved. So, if you're on a dependent visa and working part-time, you must be very careful to stay within the 28-hour per week limit. Otherwise, it will almost certainly lead to a denial of permanent residency. 2. Independent livelihood. This requirement means that the applicant must not be dependent on public assistance and must be able to support himself or herself now and in the future. This is actually one of the most common questions I get. So, how much annual income do I need to qualify for permanent residency? First, here's the basic idea. The law says that having sufficient assets or skills means you are not relying on public assistance in daily life. And based on your job or your assets, it's expected that you can maintain a stable life in the future as well. In simple terms, this means you are not receiving welfare or public assistance, and you are recognized as being able to support yourself now and in the future. So anyone who is on welfare is not eligible for permanent residency. Now, what about the income amount? Currently, in practice, the required income is at least 3 million yen per year. If your income is less than 3 million, in most cases, your application will be denied. On top of that, if you have dependents, you need to add about 200,000 yen per dependent. For example, let's say a family of 4, all foreign nationals, is applying for permanent residency. The husband is the applicant, working full-time as a company employee, while the wife is a full-time homemaker with no income, and they have 2 children. In this case, the husband has to support 3 dependents. That means the required annual income is 3 million yen plus $200,000 x3, while 3.6 million yen. This is how the requirement works in actual practice. And of course, since average incomes in Japan are rising, it's quite possible that this income requirement will also increase in the future, maybe 4 million yen, 5 million yen, and so on. Now, regarding the evaluation period, the standard rule is that your income is checked for the most recent 5 years. That means you must continuously meet the income requirement for 5 years straight. For example, if your income for the last 5 years looks like this: 4 million, 4 million, 2.5 million, 4 million, 4 million. Then even though 4 of the years are fine, because 1 year fell below the requirement, your application will most likely be denied. So yes, consistency is very important. Now, I said 5 years is the general rule, but there are exceptions. Some applicants have their evaluation period shortened to just 1 year or 3 years. 1 year. This applies to highly skilled professionals with a score of 80 points or more on the point system and who have maintained that level for at least 1 year. These people can apply for permanent residency after only 1 year. This includes not only people who already hold a highly skilled professional visa, but also those who have another visa, like engineer specialist in humanities international services, and can prove that they have 80 points or more. In that case, they can apply as deemed highly skilled professionals. For example, if you've maintained 81 points for at least 1 year, you just attach proof of that calculation when applying for permanent residency. If immigration accepts it, you can get PR in as little as 1 year. 3 years. This applies to highly skilled professionals with 70 points or more. The idea is the same as the 80-point case, but the required evaluation period is 3 years instead of 1. 3 years also applies to spouses of Japanese nationals or permanent residents. In these cases, the required evaluation period for income is also 3 years, not 5. So to sum up, regular applicants, 5 years of stable income. Highly skilled professionals, 80 plus points, 1 year. Highly skilled professionals, 70 plus points, 3 years. Spouses of Japanese or permanent residents, 3 years. That's how the independent livelihood requirement works in practice. 3. National interest. Now, let's move on to the third legal requirement. Your permanent residency must be considered to be in the interests of Japan. This is often called the national interest requirement. To meet this requirement, you have to satisfy several conditions. Let's go through them one by one. A. Residency of 10 years or more. In principle, you must have lived continuously in Japan for at least 10 years. Within those 10 years, at least 5 years must be under a work visa, excluding technical intern training and specified skilled worker type 1, or under a resident status such as spouse of a Japanese national or long-term resident. The key point here is continuously. This means your residency status cannot lapse, and your main base of life must clearly be in Japan. So for example, if you leave Japan without a re-entry permit, or if your re-entry permit expires while you're abroad, that breaks continuity. If you spend more than half of the year abroad, say 200 or 300 days in a single year, immigration may judge that you do not continuously reside in Japan, even if your visa status itself hasn't expired. In practice, if you need to be abroad a lot, for example, for overseas business trips, you'll need to clearly explain the reason, Provide supporting documents such as employer certificates and show that your base of life is still Japan. Without reasonable justification, spending most of your time abroad will almost certainly result in denial. Special exceptions to the 10-year rule. There are exceptions where you don't need a full 10 years of residence. These include 1. Spouse of a Japanese national or permanent resident. If your marriage is genuine and has lasted at least 3 years, and you have lived continuously in Japan for at least 1 year, you meet this requirement. For example, if you've been married abroad for 10 years and only recently moved to Japan, you just need 1 year of residence in Japan to qualify. 2. Long-term residents, teijusha. Those who have stayed in Japan for more than 5 years. 3. Recognized refugees, or those under complementary protection. After 5 years of continuous residence following recognition, they qualify. 4. Those who have made significant contributions to Japan in certain fields. 5. Those engaged in designated activities under the Regional Revitalization Act, very rare cases, such as researchers or IT professionals. 6 and 7. Highly skilled professionals. If you score 70 points or more, the residence requirement is shortened to 3 years. If you score 80 points or more, it's shortened to 1 year. So in the best case scenario, some highly skilled foreigners can apply for permanent residency after as little as 1 year in Japan. B. Proper fulfillment of public duties. This means you must be paying your taxes, pension, and health insurance premiums on time. It's not enough to simply catch up later. Even one late payment can cause your application to be denied. For taxes, like local inhabitant tax, highly skilled professionals with 80 points or spouses of Japanese nationals, PR holders, checked for the most recent 1 year. Highly skilled professionals with 70 points, checked for the most recent 3 years. Everyone else, checked for the most recent 5 years. For pension and health insurance payments, highly skilled professionals with 80 points or spouses of Japanese nationals, PR holders, checked for the most recent 1 year. Everyone else, checked for the most recent 2 years. So if there's even one delay in these periods, your PR will not be granted. This requirement applies not only to the applicant, but also to all family members living in the same household, even if they are Japanese nationals. For example, if you are a foreign applicant and your Japanese spouse has unpaid pension contributions, your PR application will still be denied. That's why it's extremely important that all members of your household keep up with their taxes and social insurance contributions. C. Longest period of stay applicants must hold the longest period of stay available for their visa category. At present, that generally means 5 years. However, in practice, if you hold a 3-year visa, immigration will treat it as sufficient. But if your visa is only 1 year, you cannot apply for permanent residency. D. Public health. Finally, you must not pose a risk to public health. This includes people with serious infectious diseases like Category 1 or Category 2 infectious diseases, or those suffering from chronic drug addiction. Obviously, approving such cases would not be in Japan's interest, so PR is not granted. Summary. So, to recap, to obtain permanent residency in Japan, you must meet all 3 legal requirements. 1. Good conduct. No serious violations of law. No repeated antisocial behavior. 2. Independent livelihood. Stable income of at least 3 million yen per year, plus extra for dependents, with proof over 5 years in most cases. 3. Benefit to Japan, national interest, usually 10 years of continuous residence, with exceptions, proper payment of taxes and insurance, holding the longest period of stay, and no public health risks. If you meet all 3 requirements, you can be granted permanent residency. And remember, simply getting PR is not the end. Under the 2024 immigration law revision, new grounds for revocation of permanent residency were added. That means even after you obtain PR, it can be taken away if you fail to meet certain obligations. So the key is not just to obtain permanent residency, but to maintain a stable, law-abiding, and continuous life in Japan. Please review the points carefully, and if you're planning to apply, make sure you fully meet these conditions. That's all for today. Thank you very much for watching.